Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name's Stu McKenzie. I'm Science Manager with the Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis Center, or CINA. We're very pleased to welcome you to this first of our fall talks exploring CINA's research footprint and the related topics. That, broadly speaking, by the way, is empowering and informing federal investigators and law enforcement officers. Those of you with an interest in this cluster of topics may want to join us on November 21st for a discussion of illicit trade on the dark web, and also again on December 5th for a discussion of cybercriminology. If you do have an interest in these events, folks in the room, please don't forget to sign the sheet over by the door. Folks joining us remotely, please shoot us an email and we'll make sure that you're on our mailing list for future events. This afternoon, however, it's a particular honor to present a fellow Englishman, Professor Andrew Crooks. Talk up a little bit. Andy did his PhD at University College London in geography, and he currently serves as Associate Professor at George Mason University. And he's affiliated with the prestigious Computational Social Science program and the Center for Social Complexity. He's carved out quite a reputation for himself as an expert on agent-based modeling, on geographic information systems, but also on the ways that these approaches can be applied to human behavior, whether it's how people act in the wake of a nuclear weapon of mass destruction, or whether it's modeling the dynamics of illegal border crossings. Andy's going to talk a little bit for us this afternoon about how to harness open source data in furtherance of those goals. And please join me in welcoming Andy Crooks.
Thank you, Stu. That was one of the nicest introductions anyone's ever given me. So, so today I want to talk about my work, and I don't know what the level of how much people know about what I'm going to be talking about, agent-based modeling in particular. So I wanted to talk about a few things first. I want to talk about computational social science. I don't know if many people know about this, but computational social science sort of informs a lot of what we do with respect to agent-based modeling. And then I want to talk briefly about what is ABM, or agent-based modeling, and just give you some very simple examples so we're all on the same page, or slide, so to speak, with respect to agent-based modeling. But agent-based modeling is changing, and that's changing because of new sources of data. 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, the data that we have today, this wasn't in existence. Social media, for example, or the extent of social media data. So I want to talk about how we're having new forms of data, and how this new data is basically giving us new lenses to study both physical relationships, how we interact in physical spaces, but also how we interact in cyberspaces and the connections between these areas. And this is also therefore allowing us to look at like sort of linked spaces, the linkages between social networks and where you are physically. And then to sort of end the talk, I want to just give you some very quick overviews of some of the ways where we've been using open data for our own research, looking at humanitarian assistance, pedestrian movement, using CCTV data to basically calibrate a model, wildfires and evacuations during wildfire events, and then a model that we did in 2010 or 2011 on border security, which might be of interest to some of the people in the room here. And then a summary. I should say this work is not just me. I have a big acknowledgement slide at the end, but several people in the room here also contributed to this talk, so thank you for that. So at the heart of what we do is really computational social science. And what computational social science really is exploring social problems through computational methods. So the idea is we're using a variety of tools that are available to us, machine learning, with respect to, say, new sources of data like remote sensed imagery, network analysis, network science, if you want, cell automata models, agent-based models. We fuse these together to answer social science questions. And the idea is we're trying to build models. And why do we want to build models? We want to basically gain insights into certain types of social phenomena. And the idea is if we understand, for example, how people interact with respect to housing markets, like people buying and selling houses. If we understand that, can we therefore stop a housing market bubble from occurring? If we understand how people drive individually, together, you guys form traffic jams, and I'll show an example of that later on. If we understand how people drive on a road, how they speed up, slow down, can we better manage traffic control? And living in the DC metro area, that's something that's on my mind nearly on a daily basis. Or where do you live? Why do you live where you live? How does that lead to, say, different types of neighborhoods evolving and things like that? And the idea is we're trying to build models to get a better understanding of these cases and therefore better management, stopping stock market bubbles, potentially stopping traffic jams from forming, and whatnot. So that's basically computational social science. And at the heart of that, you might be wondering, why should you care about this? And I always like two quotes from two Nobel laureates, both physicists. And this, I always think the social sciences are the hard sciences because people are not well behaved like in physics, like as Richard Feynman said. Imagine how hard physics would be if electrons had feelings or electrons could think. This is a problem. Trying to understand social systems, we're dealing with people. Everybody in this room is different. And we're trying to capture, and you all react differently to different stimuli, you have different motivations for being here and whatnot. So trying to capture that type of information and then model that to understand how something might emerge is a challenge. And, and this is like a really hard problem. Social systems, systems made up of people, organizations, are quite really difficult to understand and manage. We don't behave like particles, as I say. And recently, over the last 20 years or so, the focus has shifted on looking at social systems from, say, the top-down aggregate types of models to sort of bottom-up models where we're trying to capture individuals into these types of models. And one of the ways of doing that is agent-based modeling. I'll go into what is agent-based modeling in a little bit, but it's basically simulating a society or a group of people interacting with each other and seeing what happens over time, how these interactions go about. And just to gauge, I'm just curious, does anybody know, has anyone ever seen an agent-based model before? Some of you not. Have any of you seen any of these movies? Some of you yes, some of you no. But where you see so when you see these large crowd scenes in the movies, or when you see large fight scenes in like Lord of the Rings, or the zombies crawling up walls in World War Z, right? These are agent-based models. Of course, they look amazing, but there's individual people or agents, synthetic, they're not real people, going about doing things that causes like riots to look like fight scenes to emerge, crowds to form, and things like that. So we're trying to build models of individuals, and unfortunately, they never look as good as in the movies, and we don't have software like Massive that allows us to create these visual models. But we're trying to build models of people, which is what I'm trying to get at. But you've all seen agent-based models at a rough guess at one time of your life. In agent-based modeling, these are computer simulations in general. So we're talking about creating an artificial world in our computer. We then populate this world with agents, people. These people are connected somehow through, say, social networks, through proximity or whatnot. And they all have basically rules. And these rules lead to certain actions occurring, and those actions lead to something emerging at an end. So, for example, the way I see, and this is sort of the way I see the world, unfortunately, these days, if a certain condition is met, then take an action, or else do another thing. So, for example, if the fire alarm went off now, your action would be to get up and walk out the door, right? If the fire alarm doesn't go off, you just listen to Crooks for another 45 minutes, right? But if the fire alarm did go off, the action, by you getting up and walking out of the room, and then everybody else in what's this building called? Innovation? Exploratory Hall, getting out of their buildings, out of their rooms and exiting the building, that's going to cause crowds to form, right? That's the emergent phenomena of, say, of a building evacuation type of model. So we're trying to, and the question is, we're trying to build models to simulate people in these artificial worlds. And we can build models and explore a whole variety of different phenomena at a variety of different spatial and temporal scales. We can build models at a very fine scale, like pedestrian models, or my favorite model at the moment is a basketball model, using data from actually real basketball games. But these are like very fine scale models operating in seconds over very small, spatial scales, like a basketball court or small areas. Or we can build models looking at, say, migration and things like that operate over a larger scale. Think about the Syrian crisis at the moment. That happen over years, potentially decades, and models anything in between these types of things. So these are the types of problems we can explore using agent-based modeling. And by the way, anything I'm showing you on the slides today, all the papers, models, and things like that are available on the website, GIS Agents. So if you want to play around with them or explore them more, you can do that. So to give you a simple example of an agent-based model that's not from the movies, here is a sort of a very simple agent-based model. Each car is an agent, a person. It's like, how many people carpool on the way to work? A few of you. How many drive by yourselves? Nearly all of you, right? Imagine this is you. One person per car. That's it. So this is the agent in our model. Each agent is given some rules. So the rules are, if there's a car ahead of you, you slow down because you don't want to crash your car. If there's no car ahead of you, you speed up. Roughly, very simplistic rules. We can build models much more complicated with more complicated rules and better decision making. But just for this example, cars, individual people driving along the road. But those two simple rules, speeding up, slowing down, basically causes traffic jams to form, right? So the idea is all the cars are moving in one direction, but because of people speeding up, slowing down, you're sort of getting a traffic jam forming. And you see this on a daily basis. If you drive on the 66 around DC or the Beltway, you're going to have traffic jams forming when there's no incident. And that's purely by people slowing down, speeding up, checking their phones when they shouldn't be checking their phones while driving, and things like that. But the other thing about these types of models is that although we're modeling individual people, we're also modeling, you can get individual speeds, so say the red line here, which is the red car, but you can also sort of get the average speed of the traffic as well. So the idea is you can get a lot of types of things from these models. And the nice thing about agent-based models is that we can test ideas and hypotheses that we can't really do in the real world. I can't set the building on fire and watch how people evacuate. I'll get arrested. Or eventually I might get, right? But I can do that in a simulation. And these are the types of things that we're trying to get at with agent-based models, try to do things that we can't really do in the real world, or we don't want to wait around. For example, if you're doing an urban growth model, you don't want to wait around, or a new urban plan, a new urban development. You don't want to wait around 10, 20 years to see how the city might look like in that time. But we can simulate what the city might look like in 20 years' time. Or if you really want to, that is a very simple model, or you can do a real experiment. So this is some Japanese researchers, and there's 22 cars. Initially, they're all evenly spaced around in a circle. Each car is told to drive at a certain speed, but people can't drive at a certain speed, right? But because of that, basically, eventually, the cars start moving freely, and then eventually, the cars start rubbernecking, exactly the same as what was in the previous model. So the idea is we can build models, we can test ideas, and if you want to, if there's data, you can validate against those models, like in this simple example here. Or, instead of having to do the model per se, instead of having to get 22 people driving around in a circle, we can just simulate that. So potentially that's also more simpler to do. The last example I want to do before jumping into some of the applications about data is segregation. And I think this is quite an important phenomena because from a data point of view, when you see a segregated neighborhood, it's already occurred, right? So you can't really do much about it at that point. But then Thomas Schelling was like, why are neighborhoods segregated? What causes these neighborhoods to become segregated? And it's basically individual decisions about moving to and from locations that causes segregation to emerge at a higher level. And the question, Schelling was like, do mild tastes and preferences for like economic or demographic groups lead to segregated neighborhoods? So what preference do you want to be in a neighborhood of like types of people? How does that preference lead to segregation patterns emerging? So we can start off with a very simple model here. We have red and blue. Imagine they are two sporting teams, a red team and Liverpool and Everton. Sorry, I can't do I don't know any American teams that are red and blue. Cardinals, no, the Washington, what do you call the baseball team? Nationals, yes. Nationals versus the Boston people. Boston, yes. You're right. Anyway, imagine, they don't like living together, right? So in this simple model, you have agents, again, individuals, or you can count them as households in this example, because it's residential household types of models. Each agent wants to live in a neighborhood, so looking at its surrounding friends, where a certain percentage of the neighbors are like themselves. In this simple example, 25% of the people people here want to have a neighborhood where 25% of the people are like themselves. We can run the model from a random distribution, and basically, you don't really get much segregation occurring, right? But we can change that preference up to, say, 50% segregation. So now people want to live in a neighborhood where 50% of their neighbors are like themselves, and we can sort of see patterns of more distinct patterns of segregated neighborhoods occurring. And again, you can keep increasing this up to, say, 75%, and again, you get stronger patterns of segregation emerging in these types of models. So you really do now get sort of see segregated neighborhoods occurring. I mean, you can explore this. And these are like thought experiment types of models. So in agent-based modeling, we have like ones that you can use. The purpose of modeling, why do we model? Sometimes it's to understand, ask the what-if types of questions. Other times it might be for prediction or forecasting, right? And there's different purposes for models. This is a very simple model, just asking, what does mild tastes and preferences lead to segregation? There is a real-world example, like a real study by a guy called Isaac Benison from Tel Aviv, who actually looked at residential dynamics in a neighborhood in Tel Aviv, and basically came out with people have mild tastes and preferences for living in certain neighborhoods based on the housing style and the composition of the religious groups in that neighborhood. So, but it's still the same thing. People have mild tastes and preferences that lead to segregated neighborhoods occurring. But as a GIS guy, Stu mentioned, I like doing GIS. So I like to build models that are actually linked to geographical locations. So we have this artificial world, like we had earlier. But we can ground that artificial world with data. So instead of the cars just moving along a road, like on a straight line, we can use, say, real road network data for that. Or if you have residential dynamics, you might want to know, what type of neighborhoods are what? Are they middle class neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods, upper class neighborhoods? We can use this type of information to help infuse our model. And then we can use them as sort of layers within this. So I just want to give some very simple examples of how we can use GIS data into agent-based models before talking about how we can sort of use new sources of data, the open data sort of sources, to build these types of models. But the idea is building models that are linked to geographical information, or information that has a geographical component. A text, it can also be that. So by taking geographical data, we can go from a very simple model, say this is a simple pedestrian model. So the red is people exiting a room. It's a very simple model. You can explore some very basic ideas, like if you increase the door width, how will that increase or increase the evacuation rate, things like that. But with real data, we can build more complicated models to account for, say, the actual built environment. So for example, where are the staircases so this is first floor, second floor. There's a staircase from the first floor into the second floor, and the exit's actually on the second floor. This is the Krasno building, and things like that. But you can use data to say, okay, where are the rooms? If you had data on occupancy rates or class schedules, you can use that to inform how many people are in the building at any one time. You can work out what's the width using CAD drawings and whatnot. What's the width of the corridor? If you know the width of the corridor, you know roughly how many people can get along that corridor at any one time. You can sort of identify choke points within the system, so where people are getting choked. And the nice thing about these types of models is if you had a floor plan, we can build a model and see how potentially people will react in that space before designing the building, which potentially is a lot cheaper than building the building and then realizing you made a major mistake, right? Spatial data allows us to constrain the models to sort of real-world locations. Or, for example, if you're interested about traffic, and when I first moved to DC area, I was always amazed. Why are there so many people on the Beltway? Where do they all come from, right? And especially with respect to Tyson's Corner, because I used to drive past Tyson's Corner. But census data, travel to work information, this is Tyson's Corner. And these are census tracts where all the people from who work at Tyson's Corner come from. So we now know, for example, how many people start their journey down, say, from Richmond to Baltimore, and we know roughly how many people from one location goes to another location. And then we can say, okay, well, can we use that as an initialization of people in their cars driving to work? And can we use that data, therefore, to sort of simulate traffic jams occurring? So here, people navigating to Tyson's Corner, the blobs. When the blobs get really dense, that's sort of a traffic jam occurring. But it's like taking this abstract model that we saw at the beginning, this traffic model, and then applying it to actually real-world settings, informing that model with data. And you can sort of see, like, traffic jams forming around the Beltway, along 66 in the morning. Of course, the traffic jams will be different in the evening, and whatnot. So we can build traffic models, again, a good example where we utilize data to better build these types of models, and they try to ask, what would happen if you added a new road link? What would happen if you closed a road? How would people navigate around these types of things? But today, like when I first started this, we only had official data sets, like data from the Office of National Statistics or Census Bureau, or in the UK it would be Ordnance Survey for spatial data. But now we are awash with new sources of data, so the data tsunami, as people might call it. And I like this picture because there's a little bloke down here, you might see, scratching his head, right? And the question is, how can we utilize this data in our models, right? And that's what I want to talk about for the remaining of this talk. So we have lots of new data. This data is being contributed through Web 2 technologies, through social media, Internet of Things, and I'm classing this as open data. And what I mean by open data is data that I can get access to without having to really pay for it. So anything from newspaper reports to people checking in with, say, Swarm, which is or whatnot. And these new data sets are providing a new way to look at social systems. We can, and through mining this data, we can get patterns. We can look at, say, what are the clusters with respect to vaccination debates or whatnot. And I think what we've been doing recently with our work is trying to utilize open data and APMs to basically understand many things, specifically with respect to who is doing what, where is this occurring, because a lot of this data has a geographical component to it. And what are they doing? Are they at a concert? Have they just taken a selfie of watching a certain band last night? The White Stripes. Black Keys, sorry. Or are they like watching a baseball game? We can, you can extract that information from people's content. Same with the news stories. Roughly give you who are the actors. So Boris Johnson did something today. Why, we still don't know. And the why is a hard bit to know, right? So data doesn't necessarily give us necessarily the why, but we can potentially infer the why from other areas. But the idea is, how can we utilize data for this? So this is just some eye candy of, this is like a social network. And if you wanted to look at the social network and link it to the actual geographical locations, this is sort of the geographical locations of these people in this social network. And this was actually made by Ari, who's sitting here. So any questions, ask Ari. But this new data is great because it's giving us a whole new lens to study the city. And what I'm talking about today is basically the modeling of social systems or societies. But this new data is also allowing us new ways to monitor what's happening around us, and also analyze, and through, say, machine learning and whatnot, we can also new ways of analyze the system. And we have lots and lots of new sources of data. Initially, we started our research using just OpenStreetMap physical data sets, such as where the roads are. I'll give you an example of that with Haiti in a second. You can look at content on blogs, what people are talking about, to understand how people feel about a certain place, how topics like discourse is happening with respect to, say, are you anti-vaccination or pro-vaccination, things like that. But imagery data is also becoming more and more popular, and we have lots of new sources of data that we can fuse into this sort of cycle of monitoring, analyzing, and modeling the social systems around us. And of course, it's not just like new sources of data, it's also linking new sources of data with more traditional sources of data, more authoritative data, census data, or curated data, so to speak. So I want to now jump into how we can use this type of data into a variety of models. And the reason this is interesting is because these new data sets allow us to understand the relationships between what people are talking about in cyberspace and what people are and where they are in the physical spaces. And the idea, and the linkages between them. And you might be in one physical location, well, it's impossible to be in two physical locations unless you have real split personality. But the idea is you might be in one physical space, but you might be in one cyber community. So you might be the George Mason, following the George Mason athletics. That's like a really terrible, that's a terrible example, right? You have all the Washington Nationals on Twitter, right? That's your group. That's all that you're interested in, right? That's your cyber community, right? Or you might be, and your friend might also be following the Washington Nationals, right? Or you might be in one place, like in Washington, but you like the Nationals, but you also like where you grew up, like the Boston Red Sox, right? Or some type of this splitting type of personality. So we can sort of try to understand the linkages between the physical spaces and the cyber spaces. And to give you an example of this, if we look at the social community, we can sort of identify the clusters through social network analysis. Again, this is some work we're doing with Ari Couture. We can look at where these clusters are occurring in physical spaces with respect to Occupy Wall Street. And we can also look at sort of the linkages between the physical spaces and the cyber spaces and how information is flowing between these different areas. How somebody in Washington, D.C. posts something, how that information is then passed through the network to, say, someone in the UK or from Washington, D.C. to anyone? Somewhere near California? Utah, pardon? Utah. Never North Dakota. There's very little traffic in North Dakota in these types of things. But the idea is trying to understand the relationships, but also trying to detect events occurring in this. This is something that Tony and Ari and I were looking at a while ago now. And the idea is, during a certain activity during the Occupy Wall Street movement, you had sort of these spatial temporal clusters occurring. So in the morning, you had a cluster of activity here, in the lunchtime, activity here, then in the afternoon, a cluster here, and another cluster here in the evening. And we never knew why those clusters were occurring. But Tony found this, which was about the Occupy Wall Street, and said at 7 a.m., Occupy Wall Street, at 2 p.m., Occupy the 5 boroughs, which is this area here. Then later on, Occupy City Hall. And these clusters that we identify through social media link to these specific these information. So new source of data gives us ideas of what's happening and why things are happening on the ground. And this is giving us a new way to think about how information between cyber and physical are being linked together. So, traditionally, as a geographer, we have neighborhoods. This is what we cared about. We had census tracts, things like that. But these are relatively static. But we also have social networks from sociology. And, who's connected to who at the moment. And then, but when you start linking these two together, we've got this notion of linked spaces. In the sense that you have a social network you have your current location, and this changes and evolves through the day, through the years, and whatnot. So can we start utilizing these data, like Twitter or phone call conversations through cell phones and whatnot, to understand this idea of using new data to understand these linked types of spaces? And what I mean by this is, take any node in this network. Currently, at one point in time, then people are moving through the system, and as you move through the system, you have new connections. So currently at Mason, you're connected to each other around your table, and then later on, you'll be going back to your work locations. Different networks change. But the idea is trying to capture these types of things over space, over time. And so the question is, can we create models to capture those types of relationships? So this is a very simple model where it's a prototype. So this is George Mason campus, if you hadn't realized. And we just say, okay, this is where people live. This is where people work. Over the course of the day, people go to and from work. By going to and from work, you build different types of networks. You have your home network, you have people, friends at home, and you have your work network. During the day, your work network might be stronger than your home network, because that's the people you're interacting with. But by these simple activities of going to and from work, and this is sort of people's daily activity, aggregate daily activity patterns, we're sort of building these cyber, physical, linked spaces types of models. And you might be wondering, why is this sort of modeling approach, or why should you care about this? And we have networks of people. So here we just have nodes, people, or dots. But each node is a person with a specific age. People create household structures. So here we have a male, a female who are in their 50s, and they have, in the same household, they might have 3 people. But those people are connected to other people who you go to school with, who you go to work with, right? And the connections build up over the system. These networks are embedded in a larger area, so this notion of linked spaces. So this is like links in a census tract. That's what I figured. Jolly good. At least Siri's on board with me. But why should you care, right? Think about diseases, how disease spreads, right? So if you have this synthetic network or social network, and you have kids, and you have a kid in elementary school, another kid in high school, another kid in middle school, right? If your kid from elementary school comes home ill and then infects his brothers and sisters who are going to high school and middle school, then therefore the brothers and sisters can take the disease to those school systems, right? So what you see, the idea is networks, these type of networks, help spread information or disease propagation. So in this simulation, we start off infecting one school with a disease, and we can see how that disease spreads through the school district. But that's based on these social networks and whatnot. But you can sort of see the progression of the disease through, this is Fairfax, hypothetical model of Fairfax County, by the way. But you can then ask questions like, if you see a disease outbreak, when should you close the schools? Would that impact the spread of the disease? Which schools to close? If you know there's an incubation period of the model, you have to factor that into your decision making. And this is what you're sort of seeing here, is just the spread of the disease. This is how we think about linking these spaces together. Other applications, like now turning it from like just sort of toy models to more sort of applied models. The first example where we started using open data was looking at the Haiti earthquake from 2010. And Haiti was a big earthquake. But what was interesting about Haiti, it was the first time that the crowd really contributed new sources of data. Twitter, imagery, Facebook. A lot of information was coming out of Haiti through social media platforms. But it was also one of the first test beds for using OpenStreetMap and satellite imagery for updating the road. So can we utilize this type of new source of data with respect to agent-based modeling to help with, say, disaster relief operations, where to place aid centers and whatnot. And just to give you an idea, Haiti, this is sort of a map of Haiti, and this is before the earthquake. The earthquake happens, and you can sort of see the flickers. These are people editing from all over the world, the Haiti, based on new aerial imagery. So Haiti was one of the worst mapped countries in the world. After the earthquake, it became one of the best mapped countries in the world. And what you're seeing basically is people editing the map, and they're also documenting things like where the roads are, where sort of refugee camps occurring and things like that. These are like quite important information to know. But no one's telling people to do this. People are just doing it by themselves. And so can we utilize this new road data, to potentially ask the question, if I only had X resources, where would be the best place to site aid centers in these types of models? So we can take the data, say, from ground damage, which was from satellite imagery. So red is very badly damaged. This light color is no damage at all. And we also have some missing data. We know the population in the area. We're using Landscan for population because Haiti hadn't had a census for a long time. And then we know where the roads are and how people can navigate over the network through OpenStreetMap. Now the question is, where do we place our aid centers? And then how will people know about the aid centers, and how will they go and get food within this? So in the model, we can ask, where would be the best place to put these blue dots, right? So this is a very simple model. We place the blue dots in the model. We then the way the operation works here was the aid agencies would tell people in the neighborhood, give out tickets with respect to aid distribution, and then they would come back the next day and get their aid. But things spread. You tell your friend, and your friend tells their friend tells their friend, and what you're seeing sort of here is sort of a spread of information. Initially, only people around the aid center, potential aid center, would know where there's food, but over time, more people get to know about the food, so this is where you get more and more red. Then people are making a decision, do I need to get food? Is my house damaged? If yes, maybe I need to go and get some aid. If my house is not damaged, no, I don't. And then they use the road network to navigate through this system. And the takeaway from this model was, when we were doing it, was we thought that by placing aid centers in the areas that were most affected would be the most efficient with respect to distributing aid, but it wasn't, because it was just too densely populated, too badly damaged, so people couldn't actually get to the aid centers. This is in the model that we were developing. We can use CCTV data. This is again a new source of data. CCTV is prevalent around the US, around the world now. There's a trajectory. You can extract people's paths from this data, and therefore use that to help inform an agent-based model of how people might move through a scene. So this is a simple model where each of these are entrances and exits. People are moving through the scene. So here you've got individuals coming in and going out, the green dots in this, or green squares in this example, and eventually sort of building sort of a heat map or a movement map of people's movement through the area. Just like you see outside, how people navigate and take shortcuts across when there's no path, they'll create their own path. But we can use data to help validate our movement model, how people move through the models. And we can ask questions like, what happens if a sensor goes down? How will people move through that scene? So, for example, if we had 24 hours of CCTV data and we calibrated the model on 23 hours, but left the most busiest part of the day out, which was, in this example, 8 to 9 a.m. So we're not using 8 to 9 a.m. data. We calibrate the model on the other part of the day. Where are we looking at the flow of people through the scene, or the paths of people through the scene? Are we underestimating or overestimating the movement of people through that area? And the idea is, if we know how people are moving through an area, we can ask questions like, what happens if we close a door? What happens if we add an obstacle? How will people move around that type of area? We can use these CCTV data or trajectory data sets to help answer those questions. Same with Bluetooth data. if you have a lot of Bluetooth sensors around, you can look at street traffic or footfall data, which is being used a lot in commercial settings at the moment, in shopping malls and whatnot. So in this last example, we were asked by, we had a sponsor, EADS North America, now part of Airbus, to look at movement across the US-Mexico border, specifically part of Arizona. So I want to walk you through how we built the model and what goes on inside the model, a bit more of a deep dive. So we have red and blue. The blue in this sense is customs and border protections and whatnot. The red here are smugglers of people or drugs or whatnot. The smugglers have their own paths. They carry in loads of people or drugs and whatnot, and they move them through the environment. So just to give you the context, looking at Arizona, we know from data sources, open data, newspaper reports, breadcrumb trails, seizures, things like that, anything that we can find on the internet, where people start their journey if they're traveling on foot across this area. We know where the people are starting. We know where people are finishing, the green lines here, and we know the potential areas that people are moving through this. And we also know, it is interesting, when we were doing this study, the actual people coming in was declining, and that's because of the recession that was happening in the US at the time. But the drugs, though, on the other hand, kept constantly, were rising during this study period. So we were focusing on smuggling in the Arizona area. And the terrain in this area is interesting because there's a lot of valleys that go north-south. Yes. But the people are moving south to north. So we were asked some very simple questions. It was like, where's the best place to place? Where's the best place to place sensors? So basically, if you can place sensors, the client EADS will therefore they can control the terrain. How do you sort of optimize the mixture of different types of sensors in an area? How do you potentially maximize interdiction, people being captured? How do you discriminate against people going hiking versus people actually smuggling in here? Should you intercept early on or later and observe them? How do people actually navigate through this setting? Because it's not this, traffic's easy. When you go to work, you take the shortest path to work, right? The shortest path being time normally, not necessarily distance. Here, people are not necessarily taking the shortest path in terms of time or distance. They want to take the path that doesn't get them caught, right? So that's a behavioral heuristic that we need to capture in these models. How do organizations or people adapt to changes in border security? And things like that. These are the types of questions we were asked to explore in this model. So we had to do a few things here. First, we had to understand the terrain. So we had, and specifically if we're thinking of fixed tower infrastructure, and things like that, where potentially might you site this type of infrastructure to get best fields of view and whatnot. So for that, we needed to understand the terrain, how hilly it was, where the troughs, valleys are. We needed to understand the land cover, because forest versus desert has different types of viewing angles. We need to know about how people might navigate over this area. So we need to know things like where the roads are, where the tracks are, national parks, and whatnot. And routing is also how rough is the terrain. Is it vertical? Is it stony or whatnot? Because that impacts movement. And then to try to help with respect to how people might move through the scene, we had to consider things like population density. So the notion in the model was, when you start this movement, you don't want to be seen. So you want to avoid high population areas. This is movement via foot, not via other modes. But later on, you might want to merge into the society, blend into this type of thing. We also there's lots of information out there about seizures or deaths and things like that we got, so the sort of point of interest thing. And land ownership, like nighttime exposure is very similar to population density. Where's the lights, where's the not lights, and things. Land ownership plays a big role because there's different my understanding, and this might change now, is that depending on who owns the land, there's different access rights, right? So, and therefore that impacts how people can patrol the area. So these are the sort of data in the model, but it's a complicated system. This is a very good example of complex system because we have locations, right? And again, this is around 2009 types of time frame when we were building this. The organizations and who controls what might be a bit different now. We have these different locations, both in the US and both in Mexico, around Arizona. We know who controls what area, which organizations are operating, or cartels are operating in different areas during that time frame. We know what specialities different organizations do. So some specialize in humans, some specialize in drugs, some do a bit of both, like the Belton Levy organization at the time. And this is all important because this is how people are operating within inside of this, and it's an unintended consequence. If you change border security here, how will that impact, say, for example, what's happening on the ground? And we know different organizations have different ways of entering the US, either via SV as smuggling via. So some organizations go via tunnels, some will go via air, some will go via terrain, others will go through ports of entry. Others provide intelligence to the other cartels. It's a real eye-opener looking through all of this data to see how this ecosystem actually was working. But the thing that got me the most was the alliances, the rivalries within inside of this system. Which organizations didn't like each other, or which ones worked together. And this is important because if you alter the zone of control of one organization, you push that organization, either make it bankrupt or you push it into a new area. By pushing it into a new area, and if it goes into a new area where they have some enemies, that's going to cause problems, and whatnot. So these are the types of things that are going on inside these are the input data sets going on inside of the model. We're also interested in where might you place infrastructure. This was more tricky data to get. We had some data on where current fixed towers were and where they weren't. Where we didn't have any data, we just used viewshed analysis to say, well, this would be the best place to place infrastructure within inside of this. We know roughly where stations are, and also and whatnot. So we sort of know a little bit about the border security operations in this area. Again, this is useful for patrolling and whatnot. We had unlike the previous models, these are very simple models. This one was a much more complicated model that we needed to actually run on a cloud computer or cluster machine, but also it took a lot of processing because it wasn't just, it's a GIS data was needed here, social network information was here, we're taking data from news reports, from anywhere we could sort of get this type of information. And then we create a simulation model to ask what if scenarios. So this is sort of the model. So you can sort of change the sensor network, the coverage. So the red is the coverage. You see lots of dots moving. You see the sort of coverage changing, the dots. That's like people on foot or doing patrols in cars and whatnot. We can see the smuggling corridors. And these smuggling corridors change depending on what's happening with respect to where the blue teams are operating. So if the blue teams are operating in one concentrated area, the red teams will move their operations elsewhere because their loads are being intercepted, and therefore they're losing money. But we can ask more about the model than just what's the impact of border security on the flow of people into the system. You can also ask questions like, which organizations are being impacted by being caught. So this is sort of the wealth distribution of different organizations as you go through time. You can work out, for example, loads potentially loads being intercepted, or people being intercepted, or potentially what's not being caught. Because even with all the efforts, people are still moving into this area. And we can work out what people are doing with respect to, are they on the way, are they fleeing, are they running, and things like that. So we can get a lot of information from these types of models. We can validate these models as well against empirical data. So if we have data, for example, on seizures, does our model, our smugglers being caught in similar areas to where these seizures are happening? Or is something else, or whatnot? And of course, any model can be expanded. But this one, what would be nice would be to play around with different types of modes of penetration rather than just smuggling via foot, maybe smuggling via ports of entry and things like that. But that's a whole different area because now you have to have bribery in there and other types of issues. Also, extend it to larger areas you can do. But just to give you an example, if this is sort of real life data, so this is sort of where seizures were happening. This is like where our models predicting seizures are happening. And this is the difference between these two, right? So in some areas we overpredict, other areas we underpredict, but you get a sense of how the model works. And again, this was a very quick project. But what's interesting is we have no data in this area, but our model can simulate data in that area. The question is, if we can do that, we can then ask the question, well, if our model is predicting people using this route, can we then put a sensor in that area to ask that question? Are people actually doing that? And that's what we're trying to get at with this type of model. So just to finish, we have a lot of data, but it's still big challenge is understanding the why. Why do people do what they do? And how do people make decisions? And how do those decisions manifest themselves in something more aggregate emerging? So the patterns at the micro level emerge from micro level interactions. But these interactions are not just physical interactions, it's also the spread of information. So how people might see something online, then react to it. So if I hear rumors online, if I hear there's a wildfire happening over there, how might I respond to that? Will that scare me or not? Or a classic example, is there an active shooter alarm on the Mason campus, which happened a couple of weeks at the beginning of the semester? What would happen? Also, I think that's the great thing about modeling is that we can ask questions, we can explore these systems at a variety of different spatial and temporal scales, just like the application of small-scale pedestrian modeling to the movement across the US-Mexico border for Arizona. We can leverage the networks analysis, which is becoming more important, text analysis, content analysis, things like this. When I did my PhD, people weren't doing that with respect to ABM. Now that's becoming more and more the norm. Mining the data, doing community detection work, things like that are becoming more and more the norm. But we have to account for many things. So we have to account for the social, the economic environments, the physical environments, like in the migration model. I call it the migration, going from Mexico to Arizona. All these things play out with respect to how people are moving through that scene. But we are also interested in connections between, say, crime, urban growth, education, things like that. A lot of things are interconnected. This is where the networks are important. And what happens at one level, at the micro level, has at some point impacts the macro level at a higher scale. So, one smuggler carrying, say, drugs impacts, can impact many people or whatnot. But the big challenge with respect to most of the stuff I talked about today and using this open data, it's really building better models of human decision making and human behavior. Because, we don't behave as particles. And I'll finish with, imagine how physically particles could think. And this is the challenge we have. And I think using open data, new sources of data, and fusion, we might be able to get to a better understanding of that. So we need to leverage more and more data. I'd like to say thank you so much for listening and putting up with me for the last hour. If you want to know more, I really recommend you go and buy this book. I'm just joking. No, but as I say, anything I've talked about today and all the models are available on the website, GIS Agents. And this talk would not have been possible without many collaborators and many sources of funding. So some of you in the room, so thank you. And I apologize if I missed anyone else off here. and really open for questions.